Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming along. I'll start by acknowledging the sponsors of the OWASP conference. I've been to some fantastic talks so far, and really it's all been made possible by the group of companies that you see on the screen at the moment. So big ups to them. It's been really good. Thank you. So I'm Richard Gray. I'm the Security Operations Manager at SMX New Zealand. SMX is a cybersecurity company with a, core strength in email. We started off as an email hosting and filtering company. We've sort of broadened our sort of view since then, but email is really still our core skill. The products that we offer at SMX, so we have a secure email gateway that we deploy in front of customer mail installations, so that can be Office 365 or Gmail, or it can be on-premise mail installations. We have what we call domain protection services, so that's managed DMARC services and attack surface management. And then we also have hosted email services for ISPs. So in particular, we manage the Extra Mail platform on behalf of Spark New Zealand. My role at SMX is Security Operations Manager. I look after the SMX ESOC, so our Email Security Operations Centre. So we're responsible for monitoring, detecting and responding to abuse of our platforms and abuse targeting our customers' users. Particularly spam and phishing, inbound spam and phishing, and then looking for signs of compromise across our platforms and responding to that. My background is in infrastructure, sort of Unix systems, web applications, but I've been at SMX for 9 years now, and over that time I've sort of slowly transitioned towards sort of email operation side of things and the security side of things. So what I'm going to be talking about today is email security, obviously, but one particular aspect of email security really, that is email authentication. My original plan for the talk was for it to be a bit broader, but then I thought, well, what's the one thing that I want you to take away from this talk? And it's about email authentication and how to deploy it. So I'm talking about things like DMARC, SPF, and DKIM primarily. The focus of this talk is, or who's it for, it's for organisations rather than individuals. So companies, organisations that are needing to reach their partners, their suppliers, their customers, and their own staff. The core problem that I want to talk about is sender spoofing. I'll give you some examples of that, or a particular example that we can talk to. And then to understand why it's a problem, we'll go over the history of email and some basics around SMTP and how it works. And then we'll get into the email authentication mechanisms themselves, how they work basically, and then reiterate on why it matters, why should you care. And then lastly, I'll go through recommendations on how to configure this for your own organisation, and real-world DMARC usage, what we see across our platforms. This is what I want to talk to. So if you own a vehicle, you'll probably get a message from NZTA, from Waka Kotahi, every now and then telling you that you need to renew your registration. And the authentic messages from Waka Kotahi have this banner at the top which says, "Genuine vehicle licence reminder emails from Waka Kotahi, New Zealand Transport Agency, always come from nzta.govt.nz." And it's true, they do. But then, how do we explain this one? It's not too bad as a phishing email goes. It's, people would definitely click on this. But if we look at the sender domain there, it's support@nzta.govt.nz. So how is this possible? And how do we know that this is not a legitimate message from NZTA? And I guess, how is it possible? It's possible historically because there weren't mechanisms in SMTP or in email to prevent this type of abuse from impersonating another sender. But right now, today, there are such mechanisms, DMARC being the main one that we want to talk to. And the reason it's possible for nzta.gov.nz is because of this p equals none in their DMARC record. And I'll move on to what that means. But first we're going to go back in time to 1971 and understand where email came from. So I wanted to introduce this guy, Ray Tomlinson. So Ray was an engineer at a company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, BBN, and they were working on an operating system for the PDP-10 mainframe called 10X. So I guess at that time, on a PDP-10 mainframe, you could send a message to another user on that system. So yeah, using a program called send message, you could send, whatever you want to say, how's it going, how are you? But at that stage, there was no sort of means to, I guess networking in general was in its infancy. So it wasn't really possible to send to, an external organisation. But Tomlinson, what he did on his spare time, I know, was to combine the send message program with a second program called CopyNet, which was an experimental file transfer application. And in doing so, he was the first person to send a message sort of destined for a human between two computer systems. And he sent the message between these two PDP-10s that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there. I guess one of his big claims to fame is that in doing so, he used the @ symbol to identify the location of the sender and recipient. So it was user @ system. And we're still using that today, obviously. Ray's ideas were formalised in RFCs through the 1970s. And I guess an interesting thing to mention at this stage is that there was no SMTP at this point. And in fact, they were using FTP to transfer messages between machines, file transfer protocol. So BBN, the company where Tomlinson worked, they had a US government contract to build and operate the ARPANET, which is the predecessor to the internet that we use today. They were involved in building these interface message processors, which were effectively the first routers. And yeah, for anyone that's worked with BGP before, BBN held AS1, Autonomous System Number 1. So they were literally the first participant on the internet. There's a picture on the right there of the ARPANET in 1969 with just 4 nodes. There's 3 universities there and SRI, which is the Stanford Research Institute. 8 years later, in 1977, the ARPANET looked like this. So it expanded rapidly over that period of time. There's a few, I don't know if I can point to them here, possibly I can. Maybe not. Okay, so yeah, I guess BBN, they were the first East Coast connection. They're in the top right there. Was still mostly universities and research institutes and the odd military installation. The sort of zigzaggy line near the top left there, that's a satellite link to Hawaii, and similarly near the bottom right, you can see there's a link to Norway, and then on from Norway to London. And then, very bottom right, the Pentagon was connected, the NSA were connected, and near the top left, there's the Xerox PARC, which is a sort of quite famous research institute. They developed things like bitmap graphics, object-oriented programming, Ethernet, laser printers, a whole raft of things that we continue to use today. The purpose of telling you about this, I just sort of wanted to set the scene, right? This is very early days for networking and for computers in general. Like relative to today's internet, it was still a pretty small network, and there were high barriers to entry. Like I found a price list for PDP-10 components, and my estimate was that you were looking at least $2 million just for the computer componentry itself, not including sort of somewhere to house it, because it's still sort of a room-sized computer. So high barriers to entry. You couldn't just get on this network. The network participants were largely known to each other, as I say, relatively small. It was usually universities and research institutes. If there were signs of abuse, well, then you'd usually know who was responsible. You could go and talk to them about it. It was a government network, not for commercial or personal use, and I guess because it wasn't for commercial use, the scope for abuse wasn't immediately apparent at that stage. I guess all of this is to say that, the priority was really around interoperability, getting systems to connect to one another, and not really on security. I want to talk about this guy. So this is John Postel. He's something of a legendary figure on the internet. He was the RFC editor from 1969 until he died in 1998. So hopefully most of you know what an RFC is, but it's a series of documents that describe sort of protocols and ideas. I guess, yeah, it's the process through which most internet protocols have been standardized. And as RFC editor, John Postel had a hand in most of the protocols that we use today. So TCP, IP, DNS, HTTP, SMTP, all of these things he was involved in. He co-authored the DNS standard, so aside from editing it, and he authored the first SMTP RFC. So yeah, he's effectively the guy that invented SMTP. He's also known for Postel's law, which you can see on the screen there. So it's about, yeah, in the context of implementing a network protocol, you should be conservative in what you send and liberal in what you accept. And I guess, again, it sort of speaks to this idea of interoperability to ensure that the maximal number of systems can talk to each other. A receiving implementation should be accepting of sort of minor deficiencies or deviations in a sending protocol. And it does sound good, and I think it's probably critical to, you know, I guess the sort of expansion of the internet. But at the same time, I guess in hindsight, we can see that it's resulted in a lot of problems as well, particularly, sending implementations come to rely on the sort of liberal acceptance of a receiving implementation, and that means if you're building a new receiving implementation, you need to be bug for bug compatible with the existing ones out there, otherwise particular senders won't be able to talk to you. So John came up with the first RFC for SMTP, the Simple Mail Transport Protocol. That was in 1981. And it replaced FTP as the transport for messages across an internet, across a network. And it's been extended and adapted and developed over time since then. But it's interesting, like I took this diagram from RFC 788, which is the original. And if you look at the most recent one, I think it's 5321, the diagram is there pretty much verbatim as it was before. And if you go and look at the original RFC, it still very much resembles the SMTP that we use today. So, it's been expanded upon, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. Yeah, fundamentally, it works the same way. Sorry. I wanted to talk a little bit about the SMTP delivery model. So messages through SMTP are delivered across the internet to a recipient through a series of agents. So initially you would start with your mail user agent. So like originally that you'd probably write your message in a text editor and then use a mail user agent to submit it to the network for delivery. But today, most likely your mail user agent is something like Thunderbird or Outlook or Apple Mail or one of these. It's effectively your mail client. The mail user agent submits a message to the mail submission agent. The mail submission agent might authenticate the user. It might do basic filtering before handing it on to a mail transfer agent, an MTA, which is responsible for delivering the message between organisations over the network. The recipient MTA will take a copy of the message and hand it on to a mail delivery agent, an MDA, and then that message is passed off using LMTP, which is a simple variant of SMTP, to the user's mailbox where they can collect it using something like IMAP or POP3. I guess something to take away from this diagram is that at each step of the way, the receiving system has a decision to make about whether they're going to accept this message and pass it on and who to pass it on to. So today, a lot of these agent functions have sort of been absorbed into the MTA, subsumed by the MTA function. So you might, not always, but there may not be an MDA, a specific MDA process responsible for delivering mail. There might not be a specific MSA. This brings us to the sort of the first problem that I want to talk about, the problem with SMTP. And I guess as I said, each agent has a decision to make about whether they're going to accept a message or not. And I guess, yeah, a problem that sort of developed through the 90s, or they'd been around before that, but it became a problem in the 90s, was this idea of open relays, which were SMTP servers that will deliver mail essentially to anyone from any source to any destination. And that's a bit of a problem. It's a problem because it's essentially a gift to spammers. It makes it very easy for them to hide their tracks. They can deliver spam messages through a system that they're not responsible for. And thinking about the time, computer resources, network resources, bandwidth are all very expensive. So if you could send sort of one message with a whole lot of recipients off to someone's MTA and have that responsible for fanning it out and delivering, use their bandwidth instead of your own, then that was a pretty good way to deliver spam. So essentially, yeah, a server becomes, like the main problem is when an MTA is receiving a message from a remote source or to a remote destination. Like generally, it's fine to deliver from a local message source onto a remote destination, from local users to other local users, or to deliver inbound mail from third parties to your local users. But you shouldn't be accepting connections from a remote user to be relayed onto a third destination. So yeah, as I say, this is sort of a big problem through the 90s and early 2000s. It became recognised as a problem and people started to shut open relays down. And yeah, numbers I found suggested that the number of mail servers operating as open relays dropped from 55% in 1998 to just 1% in 2002. So it's not a huge problem today. If you do run an open relay today, you'll get blocked very, very quickly, as in other mail servers won't. You get recognised as an open relay, and other mail servers won't accept mail from you. So the next thing that I want to talk about is sort of concepts of message and envelopes. So just like a regular letter that you might put in the post box, SMTP has this notion of envelope and message. So the envelope is, it's a wrapper around the message that contains routing information to help deliver the message from the sender to the recipient. Generally, as a user, unless you've run your own mail server before, you've probably never seen the envelope. It's used by the MTA. Generally, it's identifying who the message is for and who it's from. And the reason that they need to know who it's from is so that in the event that it can't deliver to the onward recipient, they can return a non-delivery notification back to the sender. And then we have the message, which is the actual message content that as a user of email you're most likely to see, and that's comprised of metadata, which are the headers, the from header, the to header, the subject, the date, etc., and the body of the message, which is the message content. Could be plain text or HTML, and might include attachments. It's important to understand that the envelope and the message are completely independent. Just like a letter that you put in the post box, you could put anything you like on the envelope essentially, and likewise, you could say that it's whoever, who's this letter from. You could put anyone's name that you like. They're completely independent. And I guess originally there was nothing to verify that the information that was provided was in fact true. So this brings us to the second problem, which is that of sender spoofing. And again, it's the question of an MTA receiving a message and should it accept it or not. Sender spoofing is the creation of an email message with a forged sender address, and it's typically intended to mislead the recipient, probably for purposes of spam or phishing or other types of fraud. In the diagram that we've got up here, so we've got, might be a little bit hard to read, sorry, but you've got Mallory sending a message to Alice, but impersonating Bob. And the question we're really seeking to answer here is how can Alice know that this message came from Mallory, or how can she know that it's not a legitimate message from Bob? And it's really up to Alice or Alice's MTA to scrutinise the message in the envelope to determine whether this is legitimate or not, whether it should be accepted. And this is sort of the key problem that email authentication is intended to solve. It's how do we verify the sender of a message? How do we know that this message came from the person that it's claiming to originate from? We're making an assumption here that, email authentication typically is concerned with authenticating a domain. Do we know that, did the owner of this domain send this message? It's making an assumption that the sending domain has appropriate controls over their own mail environment and there's not impersonation going on within the domain, which can be true. It's frequently not true. For example, if you've got like a compromised mail, you've probably received spam from gmail.com, for example. They've got a compromised mail account there. So I guess the first mechanism that was come up with to try and address this problem was the Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. And it's a system that allows a domain owner to advertise which servers, which IP addresses are authorized to send mail for their domain. It applies to the envelope sender address and not the from header address. And I think the reason for that, like at the time it was developed, early 2000s, I guess typically MTAs were more focused on, as I said, the envelope is for the MTA. And at that stage, they probably weren't parsing sort of message details from the message. The way SPF works is that as the owner of a domain, you register an SPF policy in the DNS for your domain. It's just a text record that goes in there, and then you send a message. A recipient MTA receiving a message from your domain can then go and look up that policy and check to see whether the IP that was trying to deliver the message is authorized by the policy. The outcome from SPF will either be essentially a pass or a fail, and then what that means for the receiving MTA is actually it's a matter of local policy. They can decide. The SPF RFC sort of tries to guide you in a direction, but it's not sort of categorical. It's ultimately up to the recipient. They can decide to pass the evaluation and deliver it on, or to reject it. This is an example of a typical SPF record here. So there are a number of mechanisms. So to start with, we've got, you'll expect to find the SPF version, that's mandatory. And then you've got, these mechanisms that match on IP addresses. So the first one there matches on that particular address range. So if you receive a message from an IP address that matches that range, then that's an SPF pass, and you can probably accept the message. As soon as you match on any of these, then you don't need to process any further mechanisms. Include looks up SPF policy at a second domain, and then at the end you'll typically have some sort of catch-all, the all record there, and depending on the character in front of it, it can mean one of a number of things. But most commonly you'll either see a tilde or a hyphen, or a minus. Minus all is a hard fail, which is sort of explicit disapproval of anything that hasn't matched, whereas soft fail is sort of weak disapproval. You shouldn't reject it outright on the basis of that result, but you should treat the message with additional scrutiny. So weaknesses of SPF, so it doesn't work well when you're forwarding messages on. So like pretty common practice to forward messages around. Maybe you're forwarding from your work address to your personal address while you're on holiday, something like that. But typically the SPF policy for the domain that originated the message isn't going to authorize the MTA that's doing the forwarding, and therefore it can fail at the second hop. There are limits on the size of an SPF policy, which is probably not going to be an issue unless you're running a major mail installation, but it can be something that you run into. But the biggest thing is that it only protects the envelope sender and not the from header. So this brings us to domain keys identified mail, or DKIM. So this has sort of similar goals to SPF, but it does it in a different way. It uses digital signatures to verify the sender's domain and to ensure email integrity. By email integrity, I mean that we can verify using DKIM that the message has not been modified in transit. So there hasn't been a middleman that's edited the message to defraud the recipient. So an MTA sending a message will add a cryptographic signature to the message's headers, then receiving servers can validate the signature using the sender's public key. So step one with DKIM, you generate a key pair, it can be RSA key pair, you load the private key into the MTA for message signing, and then you store the public key in as a DKIM record in DNS. And then when you subsequently, generally you're not going to have to generate the key pair yourself. I'm working on the assumption, like if you're using someone like Office 365, then there are sort of options within the product. You can go and set this up. They will generate the pair, and usually there's just a DNS record that you need to add to get that working. So yeah, DKIM signing and validation. So when you send a message, Bob sends a message and it hits his MTA, which now has DKIM signing enabled. The MTA will sign the message. So it's looking at specific headers in the message and the body of the message, and it signs those independently. So you can tell independently whether the headers or the body have been modified, and it delivers that signed message on to the recipient. At that point, the recipient can look up the DKIM record of that sending domain, pull out the public key, use that to validate the signature, and then they have, again, either a pass or fail, which they can use. Again, DKIM is not prescriptive in what you do with the results. Like it talks about using this as an input to message filtering, or using it as an input to perhaps a domain reputation system. So, you know, okay, well, this definitely came from this domain. They have good reputation, and therefore I'm going to deliver it. Or you know, alternatively, maybe you know, okay, we don't want a lot of mail from these guys. DKIM can be, so when messages are passed around, they can be signed by any intermediary. They don't necessarily have to be signed by the original owner of the domain, although that's most useful to us for the purpose of this talk. So yeah, DKIM strengths and weaknesses. So content integrity is a big one. So yes, verifying that a message hasn't been modified in transit, that's a pretty important property. DKIM is compatible with forwarding. So this issue that we had with SPF where you can't forward messages around, that's not generally a problem for DKIM, as long as you are not modifying the message when you forward it on. That can still be an issue for mailing lists. And non-repudiation, almost an unintended sort of property of DKIM, but it gives you cryptographic proof that a particular message did originate from a given domain, or at least it was handled by that domain. By attaching a DKIM signature to a message, a domain is sort of asserting a responsibility for that message, or they're asserting that they did handle that message. But again, just like SPF, it doesn't necessarily protect the from header. Like I said, you can, any domain can sign a message. There's nothing that guarantees that the message in the from header is one of those domains. So the domain in the from header is one of those DKIM signing domains. And I will mention it's vulnerable to replay attacks. So if you've got a signed message from someone that you can then relay on, yeah, there are vulnerabilities there. Yeah, you can work around that by signing the date header. Okay. So we've got SPF and we've got DKIM. So we've got these two authentication mechanisms, and they allow us to authenticate a message to a domain. But as of yet, there's nothing that guarantees that the domain that we see in the message, the from header domain, is one of those domains that has been authenticated. So this is really where DMARC comes in. And it does this through what is called authentication alignment. So it requires that it basically looks at the from header domain and then expects that for that domain, it's either passed SPF or it has a valid DKIM signature. So it's effectively linking SPF and DKIM back to what we see in the from header, protecting the domain that you see as a recipient of a message. DMARC provides for policy enforcement, so it provides allows the domain owner to make stronger assertions about how messages that fail authentication should be dealt with. So, and the options here are none, do nothing with it, just report the failure, but don't otherwise handle the message in any particular way. Typically, that's likely to mean that the message will get delivered. You can request that messages are quarantined, which effectively means treat them as suspicious. Often that means the message will get delivered to a junk folder. It could be, it might just sort of be an input to a spam filtering system that causes the message to be rejected. It means treat the messages as suspicious. And then there's reject, which means that the domain owner wishes for messages that fail DMARC authentication to be rejected outright. So when you've got a none policy, I mentioned that it sort of says do nothing but report back. DMARC includes reporting. So for any NTA out there on the internet that receives a message that appears to come from your domain, it's going to send usually daily reports back to an address that's nominated by the domain owner. So through that mechanism, you can find out who is sending messages from your domain what were the authentication results for those messages? Are they passing authentication or are they not? Sort of it provides a feedback loop so you as the domain owner can find out how your messages are being received. So DMARC is very similar in terms of operation to SPF and DKIM. You register your DMARC policy in the DNS and then send a message to your recipient. The recipient MTA can then can resolve the DMARC policy and then evaluate that against the SPF and DKIM results and then decide what to do with the message according to your policy, and then at some time later deliver reports back to you. This is a fairly typical example of a DMARC record. So again, DMARC version, this is the policy. So there's a reject policy there. And then we have so this is the aggregate report address. So but any messages received on behalf of this domain, reports will be delivered via email back to this address. This is a simplified view. There are plenty of other tags that sort of control how the reporting works and how the alignment works. But that is a functional DMARC record, sort of quite a minimal one, and perfectly good for most cases. Okay, so why should you care about email authentication? So it's about protecting your brand. It's preventing impersonation of your brand, preventing unauthorized use of your domain, which will basically builds trust with your email recipients. Your recipients will know that a message from your domain can be trusted. And it protects your staff, suppliers, customers through that mechanism from phishing and other scams. You may well have heard that from this year, Google and Yahoo now require that all senders implement SPF and DKIM, and that bulk senders must implement DMARC. If you don't do this, then they will either reject messages or mark them as spam, deliver them to a junk folder. So a bulk sender is defined by Google and Yahoo as any sender that has ever sent more than 5,000 messages in a day to one of their platforms. Could be you, might not be, depending on the size of your organisation. So it's definitely something to be aware of. Deliverability is a major concern. You want to be able to reach your users, and increasingly you have to have these authentication measures in place in order to reach your users. And then lastly, compliance. So for any government agencies or any organisations that are providing services into government, DMARC is now mandated by the NZISM, that's the New Zealand Information Security Manual. If you're working with government or if you're in government, then you should care. So these are our recommendations. So DMARC with an enforcing policy. So by enforcing, I mean reject or quarantine. It's essential, and a none policy is not enough. If you are registering a new domain, then set up DMARC reject on day one, right? Like on day one, you're not going to have any mail sources for it. There's no better time to turn it on. But I'm assuming that usually people are coming to this and they've already got some domain that they're sending mail from that they want to enable DMARC for, in which case you need to be more cautious. So what you want to do in those cases is start with a none policy, i.e. just report back, and consume the reports into a DMARC report analyzer. So there are a bunch of these services out there. They can be, they're relatively cheap, and there are free ones, but they will take all of those reports in, aggregate them, and then provide you with sort of a visual representation of what's going on in your domain. Don't just dump them in a mailbox, because you won't be able to analyze them there. You won't do anything with them. They're XML reports. You'll get hundreds of them per day, and it's just a headache. Like, just find a report analyzer that you like the look of, and consume your reports there. With that none policy in place, you want to identify legitimate mail services and then configure them for DKIM and SPF. So generally, I'm assuming you're using, Gmail, 365, maybe Amazon, SES, these sorts of things. All of these providers have advice on how to set up your DKIM and SPF records, how to set up DKIM signing, and how to configure your SPF record. So talk to your mail providers. It'll be obvious from the reports what sources are there. Like, usually the legitimate ones will stand out, and then you can sort of tick those off. And then finally, once you're happy that you have all of your legitimate mail services configured for DKIM and SPF, then you can transition to DMARC enforcement. We would recommend DMARC reject, but you might consider quarantine as an intermediate step. And quarantine, like, it's perfectly fine. A lot of people use quarantine. As I say, it means that messages will be treated suspiciously. Usually that means they get delivered to a junk folder. So when you're configuring SPF, again, speak to your providers, find the legitimate sources and add them to your SPF record. Our recommendation is to use softfail. Although it's sort of a weak assertion of authorization, when it's used in combination with DMARC, it's just as strong as a hard fail record. And in fact, what we see is that some providers will reject a message outright on the basis of an SPF hard fail record and never evaluate the DMARC policy. Generally, DMARC is preferable to SPF alone, so that's why we suggest SPF soft fail. And the biggest problem that we see with SPF is invalid records. Fortunately, it's very easy to check your record. MX Toolbox has a great tool. You can just put your domain in, find out what your SPF record is and whether it's valid. Checking for things like syntax errors. You're only allowed to have a single SPF record for a domain. If you have two, then that's an error. Okay, and then for DKIM, again, talk to your providers, configure DKIM signing on legitimate sources, make sure that the DKIM signing domain aligns to your sending domain. So there's sort of a snippet from some mail headers here, and by default with DMARC, when we're talking about alignment, we're talking about relaxed alignment, which means that the organizational domains have to be aligned. So any subdomain that's involved doesn't actually matter. I would stick with relaxed alignment unless you have a strong reason not to, and again, it's the default. Usually, like I said before, usually your provider will enable DKIM signing for your domain, and all you have to do is set up a DNS record that delegates authority for that DKIM record to your provider. And you can have many DKIM records, unlike an SPF record. So those are our recommendations on email authentication. So next, I just want to sort of present some numbers that we see across SMX platforms around DMARC usage. So I mean, take this with a grain of salt. I pulled numbers for 1 week only, so it's it's not necessarily representative as a whole, but I think it's probably a fair sample. So in that 1 week, we saw 37 inbound messages to SMX platforms, and of that, 92% of them were already protected by DMARC. So that sounds pretty good. 34 million messages protected by DMARC, and across 184,000 domains. But then when we look at the enforcing DMARC policies, only 62% of the messages had an enforcing DMARC policy, and only 32% of domains. So what this suggests to us is that the big providers, the sort of bulk mail senders, they've already adopted DMARC, and they've already adopted DMARC enforcing policies. But there's a long tail of smaller domains that have yet to transition to DMARC enforcement, and that's kind of why I wanted to talk about email authentication and DMARC today, because I believe there's probably people in the audience that are in this position. SMX, we had a none policy until more recently than I'd like to admit. So if we sort of just narrow this down to just New Zealand domains, so either a .nz domain, and then I've also separated out New Zealand government, so govt.nz. So we can see that New Zealand's, by both messages received and domains, sort of New Zealand's lagging the rest of the world slightly. So yeah, we'd like Kiwis to up their game a little bit. And I guess the other thing that's interesting here is, I guess, quarantine a little bit more popular in New Zealand. And I think particularly for New Zealand government, quarantine seems to be very popular. I'm not sure if that's due to some sort of internal mandate or if it's just coincidental. But I think that's probably skewing the overall sort of New Zealand numbers as well. That's why sort of, yeah, we see sort of increased quarantine for New Zealand as a whole, yeah, because of the prevalence for the government domains. So New Zealand top senders, again, just across this 1 week. And so we've got overall on the left and then government senders on the right. So we can see for on the overall side of things, the sort of big brands that you're probably familiar with, and you can see that overwhelmingly they've moved to DMARC enforcement already. There are just two out of the 10 that are on none policies still, and those commercial domains are generally favouring reject over quarantine as well. And then, yeah, New Zealand government, just 5 out of 10 domains with an enforcement policy. So we'd like to see an improvement there. And again, as I mentioned, it's been mandated by NZISM, so we expect that to improve sort of over the near future. And in fact, while I was pulling these numbers, the particular week that I had to pull, I think it was sort of the week to the 3rd of September, I noticed that Department of Conservation at the bottom of that list, they had transitioned from a none policy to a quarantine policy. So that's great to see things moving in the right direction. Right, this is pretty much the end of my talk. I just wanted to leave you with some homework. So please, yeah, go and you can probably do this right now on your phone if you wanted, but yeah, check for your domain, go and find out if you have a DMARC record, and like, is it valid? Again, MX Toolbox, so yeah, free tool, no affiliation to SMX. Yeah, it's got all sorts of things to sort of verifying the health of your email domain. But yeah, go and have a look. Yeah. Do you have one? Is it valid? And what policy is being, if you do have one, what policy is being used? Is it none? Is it quarantine? Or is it reject? And where are the reports going? Are they going to an analyzer service, or are they just being dumped in a mailbox somewhere? Think about who you might need to talk to in order to get those somewhere useful where they can be acted upon. And then, yeah. SPF as well. I mention it because it's a real easy one to check, and you want to make sure that it's you're valid and yeah, it's not sort of subject to any sort of syntax problems. It's a bit harder to say whether you've sort of captured all of your legitimate mail sources in your SPF record, but that's where the DMARC reporting will come in. DKIM, I haven't mentioned it, it's a little bit harder, but yeah. The one takeaway, please go and check your domain, see what it looks like. It's yeah, easy to do, it's free. Again, for the reporting service, so I used one called Postmark for my own personal domain. It's totally free. It's kind of limited. Like I think they just sort of give you top 10 sources, and it's just a weekly email. But if you're not sending a huge amount of mail from your domain, that might be perfectly sufficient. Otherwise, if you're sending a lot more mail, then there are sort of, bigger and more sophisticated DMARC analyzers out there. And that is the end of my talk.